Joseph, chagrined but noble, determined to take care of things quietly so Mary would not be disgraced. While he was trying to figure a way out, he had a dream. In the name of the living God, amen. Let's be seated. When I was just out of college, I was part of a men's group at Calvary Episcopal Church in Columbia, Missouri. We didn't really do that much. Pretty much just got together for coffee and breakfast 1 or 2 Saturdays a month. We didn't do much except show up, and that was kind of the point. We called ourselves the Joseph Group because someone had noticed that whenever there were paintings of the Holy Family, Joseph was there, but he always seemed to be standing off to the side looking like extra baggage. Not really sure why he was there, but hanging in there just the same. We thought it was funny, mostly because we thought it pretty much described us as a bunch of guys who really didn't do that much but still showed up, who maybe didn't bring a lot to the table, but were in it for the long haul. You know, Joseph. Truth be told, that isn't a bad description of Joseph. And yet Joseph has much to teach us, particularly those of us whom the world grants position, power, and privilege. Matthew says the birth of Jesus took place like this. His mother Mary was engaged to be married to Joseph. Before they came to the marriage bed, Joseph discovered she was pregnant. Let's press pause right there. And think of what this news was like from Joseph's perspective. The woman you are going to marry is pregnant, and you know for a fact that this child is not yours. And though she fiercely denies having slept with another man and tells this, frankly, fantastic story of angels and the child being conceived by the holy breath of God, still for Joseph, imagine the feelings. Betrayal, pain, anger, fear, shame. If you have ever been cheated on by a lover, if you have ever been betrayed by a friend, you know these feelings well, because once we feel them, we never forget how they feel. We never forget how they feel in the pit of our stomach. We never forget how they feel in the boiling of our blood. We never forget how they feel in the depth of our breaking heart. We can imagine these feelings and more were swirling around inside Joseph, and one more too. A struggle. A struggle to keep an outward face that doesn't betray his inward turmoil, because Matthew says Joseph was noble. In the Greek, the word is dikaios, upright, just, someone who followed the law, someone respectable. Joseph was a good man. Joseph was a good man, to be sure, and he was also a respectable man. Even if he wasn't rich and powerful, he still had standing in the community. And as much as he must have been wrestling with all sorts of feelings, he also had relationships of respect that he valued and wanted to preserve. And Joseph was different from Mary in that he had the options of privilege. He could distance himself from this pregnancy that the world would have seen as sin and slip back into the crowd and pass. He could choose to have this pregnancy not be about him at all. Now, Joseph could have accused Mary of adultery, and that would have been a capital offense. But Joseph was a good man. And so Matthew tells us he did not want her to be disgraced, but Joseph was also a respectable man. And that means he didn't want any of that public disgrace rubbing off on him. As a respectable man, he wouldn't want the guilt and shame by association that could damage his own reputation and standing and relationships in the community. So Matthew tells us that he determined to take care of things quietly. The perfect solution for a good and respectable man. With a little luck, Mary would avoid being accused of a capital crime, and she might even dodge a life of shame and ostracization, though that was far from certain. And for Joseph, he wouldn't have to have her around as a constant reminder of his own pain, and in time, he could hope his pain, anger, and feelings of betrayal would fade, and in the meantime, he could preserve his respectability. For Joseph, it seemed the closest thing to a win-win that could come out of a terrible situation. Now, the story could have ended there for Joseph, and nobody would have blinked or questioned him at all. He would have a clean conscience and his respectability intact. In fact, anyone who even knew a part of the backstory would have credited him with being extraordinarily generous. But that's not what God had in mind, because the story didn't end there. God's angel spoke in a dream. Joseph, son of David, don't hesitate to get married. Joseph, the angel said, I know you are a good man. I know you are a respectable man, but the time for respectability is over. Respectability is about not getting your hands dirty, and the time for keeping your hands clean is over. Respectability is about doing the good thing as long as it doesn't mean doing the risky thing. And the time for shying away from risk is over. Respectability is about caring more about preserving position, power, and privilege than standing with those on whose backs your position, power, and privilege is maintained and achieved. And if there has ever been a time for that, in the birth of Jesus, God was saying that the time for that was over forever. What the angel invited Joseph to do was to move from respectability to solidarity. To move from being the one who didn't actively do anything wrong to being the one who stuck his neck out to do what was right. To stop singing Aaron Burr's "Talk less, smile more, don't let them know what you're against or what you're for." To give up trying to get ahead and stand up and say what needs to be said, even though you know that fools who run their mouths off wind up dead. The angel invited Joseph to move from respectability to solidarity. To go all in with Mary, no matter what the cost to himself. To care more about giving away power than preserving it for himself. To care more about loving the world than safeguarding his place in it. The angel invited Joseph to move from respectability to solidarity, to leave behind the cowardice of mutely not being against and yet still not standing up and being for, to recognize that silence is complicity and dismissal is erasure, and that neither is worthy of us as images of the living, loving God. The angel invited Joseph to join God's rejection of respectability and embrace God's revolution of love. To join the God who herself was willing to leave the respectability and honor of heaven, because heaven, of course, is the respectable place for God to be. And to join with the messiest and most disrespectable that the humanity had to offer. To risk everything with no promise of success or even survival. To join God in laying his very life on the line for the sake of love. To join God in experiencing what God in Jesus would come to know, that there is no greater joy and love than this, to lay down one's life for one another. The story of Joseph is the journey from respectability to solidarity. And we remember Joseph today because this Joseph, who had everything to lose and nothing to gain but his soul, doesn't dismiss Mary quietly, but looks her in the eyes and sings the love song of Ruth to Naomi, "Do not press me to leave you or to turn back from following you. Where you go, I will go. Where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. May the Lord do thus and so to me, and more as well, if even death parts me from you." The story of Joseph is the journey of respectability to solidarity. And those of us with position and power and privilege have much to learn from his example. That in a world that exalts hubris, Joseph is our model of humility. That in a world that feeds our sense of righteous entitlement and tells us to center our own feelings at all times, God calls us to be like Joseph, and not to bury our feelings, but to give primacy to the feelings of those who are more marginalized than us. To use our power and privilege to center the concerns of those who have the least and whose suffering is the greatest. To be bold and fearless in speech and action and use our power to confront the powers that oppress the children of God. To do what members of this community are doing right now as they gather downtown at Pershing Square for the California Fearless United rally and march in solidarity with those among us whose rights are under attack by the coming administration. To venture out of our safe places into communities of the vulnerable and marginalized and not take center stage and take over, but like Joseph, to show up and to use our position, power, and privilege to amplify and empower these other voices, to honor and follow the leadership of the marginalized, to put our very lives on the line when we personally have everything to lose and nothing to gain. Nothing to gain except our souls. Nothing to gain except the incredible joy of binding ourselves to one another in the same way that God herself binds herself to us in Jesus the Christ. As the Episcopal Church that was planted and has lived most of its entire existence in the soil of respectability, following the call of God and the example of Joseph means recognizing that it is long since past time for this church to be transplanted into new soil. The soil of the people, the soil of the streets, the soil not of the historic church of the presidents, but the church of the day laborer and the church of the transgender teen. That particularly as we move into a time where the threat to those most vulnerable among us from the powers of American empire is rising, that we refuse to let anyone be dismissed quietly so that our respectability might be preserved. That we refuse to let our fragility and fear trump our commitment to justice and peace. That we refuse to even put our own survival as a church or a denomination ahead of God's revolution of love that aims to put down the mighty from their seat, lift up the lowly, exalt the humble and meek, and send the rich empty away. As we stand on the doorstep of Christmas, the angel is speaking to us as well. He is inviting us out of this chancel and into the streets, courtrooms, hospital rooms, classrooms, shelters, Planned Parenthood clinics, dance clubs, and everywhere God's marginalized children are being oppressed and targeted. He is inviting us to meet Jesus in these places, to stand aside and let who Howard Thurman calls the Jesus of the disinherited lead us from these places, and with Jesus on our hearts, to make the journey of Joseph, the journey from respectability to solidarity. To risk everything with no promise of success or even survival. To join God and Joseph in discovering the joy of laying our very lives on the line for the sake of one another. The joy of going all in with each other for the sake of love. Amen.